Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Fun with Maps. I'm your host Dan Hanson, and let me start off this episode with a familiar story from the Old Testament. So you know that Moses' mother wanted to protect her baby from Pharaoh, who was killing the Hebrew children, and she took Moses, the baby, put him in a basket, put him in the Nile River. Okay, it's floating. And Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. She saw the basket, retrieved the baby, saw that it was Hebrew, hired a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby back to health, take care of him, happened to be Moses' mother, and saved the baby. Later, as Moses got older, she had to be returned to Pharaoh's daughter, who raised him as her son. In fact, the word Moses in Hebrew means drawn from the water. So the Nile River has had historical and cultural and commercial and military and every kind of influence on the whole world, but especially Egypt and Sudan and Africa, and that's what we're going to look at today on the map. So we're going to cover some of that. In fact, one very interesting aspect of the Nile River that just makes it very unique among rivers. And it's interesting because here in Africa, part of the Nile starts down here, comes up, and at about Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, there's also part of the Nile here, the Blue Nile, in the mountains of Ethiopia, that comes over here, and it meets up with what's called the White Nile down here, and they've joined forces and become the Nile River, and it goes up here through into Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria, into the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River we know. So it's these two main tributaries, the Blue Nile and the White Nile, that form the Nile just north of Khartoum in Sudan. So let's take a closer look at the Nile River and find out some fun things about it. Here's a closer look at the Nile going through Egypt and the north of Sudan. Egyptian civilization, the Sudanese kingdoms, they've depended on the Nile River since ancient times. Most of the population in the cities of Egypt lie along those parts of the Nile Valley north of Aswan. Aswan is probably like between the P and the T here, where it says Egypt, that's Aswan. All the cultural and historical sites of ancient Egypt are found along the riverbanks. In fact, the country of Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile, because without this river, this magnificent river going through it, everything around would be a desert. The Nile River gives life and allows for population. So nearly every year, the Nile River would overflow its banks, and the snow would melt from the mountains in Ethiopia and to the south in Africa, and when that did it, the soil near the banks would overflow. River would overflow, and the soil would be rich and fertile, in sharp contrast to the desert that surrounded everything else in Egypt. So, in modern times, to control this flooding, like say Aswan is about here between the P and the T, they had built a dam. The Aswan Dam, Low Dam, but in the between 1960 and 1970, they built the Aswan High Dam here in Egypt, and that's to control the flooding, to increase water storage for irrigation, generate hydroelectricity, all that stuff. So this Aswan High Dam here is, I think at one point it was called the eighth wonder of the world. It's crucial to Egypt, and a significant effect on, not only their culture, but their economy. Here you can see how long the Nile River is. It's generally regarded as the longest river in the world. It's about 4,100 miles from its origin here into the Mediterranean Sea. Some people claim that the Amazon River in Brazil, South America, is longer, but I think most people agree that the Nile is the longest. It's between 2 miles and 30 miles wide, depending on where you are along the river. Okay, and here's what I think is the most fun part about the Nile River. It's a north-flowing river, which is very unusual for a river. We look at the map here and you think, okay, it's coming down from the Mediterranean, ending up in Central Africa. That's not the case. It actually starts down here and starts over here and flows northward and empties into the Mediterranean. You have the Nile Delta up here. So it's because of these two major tributaries, as we mentioned, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. So they got the White Nile starting down here, coming up, traveling along, and when it gets to just north of Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, it merges with the Blue Nile. Now the Blue Nile starts over here in Ethiopia, and it circles around and comes here, and it looks like the Blue Nile is much smaller, much less significant than the White Nile, but actually much of the silt and water come from the Blue Nile tributary. So the White Nile here, the Blue Nile here, they merge just north of Khartoum and Sudan and come up to form what we commonly call the Nile River here up in Egypt. Here in this map you can see a little better. You see the White Nile down here. Here's Rwanda. I think the Nile goes through like 11 different countries. So it's really an international river. Here's the White Nile, Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, and here right at Khartoum. And here we've got the Blue Nile from Lake Tana in Ethiopia coming around, and they merge here at Khartoum. They go up here, and here you can see better where Aswan is, and the Aswan High Dam built. And of course Cairo up there and Alexandria. So you can't undervalue the importance of the Nile River to not just Egyptian culture, but African culture, history, politics, commerce, every aspect of life. So those are some interesting things about the Nile River. Of course, there's so much more. Besides the Moses story, the Nile River played an important part in the spiritual lives of Egyptians. They used to worship a god called Hapi, H-A-P-I, and he was thought to control the flooding of the Nile, so they prayed to him, made offerings to him. Also, they thought the Pharaoh could control the flooding, which obviously couldn't. They also worship a god named Ra, the sun god. You may have heard of him. Every day Ra makes his journey from the east to the west. So to the east of the Nile River, that was considered the land of birth, growth, health. And to the western part of the Nile, that was the death and the afterlife, as a causeway to the afterlife. So the Egyptians built all their tombs and buried people to the west of the Nile to make sure that they would get into the afterlife. So you've got that distinction there. I think to me the most interesting part of the Nile River in this episode of Fun with Maps is that it's a northward flowing river. It goes from south up to the north. That's so unique in rivers. And I expect to hear from some Brazilians or others that who claim that the Amazon is longer. Let's hear it. Thanks for watching this episode of Fun with Maps. We'll see you next time.